There was a video that I saw on Doug Polk's channel, which really made me feel happy as a coach because it really reminds me that 90 to 95% of poker students are going to fail.
I think there's a real misconception in poker. I'm sure you've seen this with a lot of the guys that you worked with, and I saw this along the way. I mean, I coached so many guys in Heads Up, and most of them failed brutally. I love saying this. I think my top 5 students made me 110% of my money, something like that, right?
Yeah, yeah,
And then the
yeah,
rest were net losers as a combined group. But then the Jimmies, the Dongs, those guys,
yeah,
they
yeah.
killed it, right? So
It was the same for me, right? Like I gave like each one of my horses like the same amount of coaching, the same amount of getting bitched at, and some like did really well. Like, and then there's others that don't make it past like 1-2, or don't make it past 2-4. And it's not a testament to the coach or the process. It's a testament to the individual.
As Doug said, there is a broad misconception among poker students that just because you get coaching or you buy expensive courses or you spend a lot of time in front of a solver, that you're instantaneously going to become a crushing player. But this is not true at all. And this is especially not true at the mid stakes, because when you get to 2-5 or 5-10, most of your opponents are going to be studying, they're going to get coaching as well. And so you have to still have an edge against these players who are often receiving the same information. So you either have to get better information than your opponents, or you need to be absorbing the information that you guys are receiving in a more meaningful way. That can be, applying the information in more practical ways. It could be getting more from your simulations, etc. But you need to be gaining a deeper holistic understanding of poker over your opponents in order to really have an edge on them. How do you get really good at poker when everyone has similar information? How is it that some players who receive coaching go on to play the 100K games and some of the players cannot beat 10 no limit? Before I get into poker, I really want to talk about Poetry Slam. So in the early 2000s, spoken word was really in vogue, and so you had these spoken word competitions called Poetry Slams, where you would go up and read a poem for 3 minutes, and you were judged by random members of the audience. Even at like the national and international level, just total nobodies on the street were saying, okay, cool, I like this poem or not, which was, pretty wild. And so in 2003, I was on the national youth championship team. And when I go back and I think about how did we actually win this youth championship, it actually it's not really a surprise or it's a secret. So how do we do this? First, this was in the era before YouTube, and so it was not as easy to just look up a random tutorial online or see, what other people were doing at championships. I had to go and buy these things called DVDs, where I had to spend $30 a pop, and they give me 2 little compact discs that had videos on them, which is this crazy antiquated idea. But we would sit around and we'd watch these videos and we'd be like, oh man, this is really good. Why is this really good? What are the techniques that this person is using to make this really powerful? And we would take all the techniques that we really loved and add them to our own skill set, and we would look at the things that annoyed us and we thought that were really distracting, and we'd remove them from our skill set and commit to never use them. And so then we would sit in workshops together. We would train and drill all of these best practices until all of us were really good at them. But so when we look at this path to how we won nationals, it's actually pretty obvious. We identified techniques that were used by elite level performers. We created dedicated practice in our workshops to apply the techniques that we learned. We put in months more reps than all of our opposition. And this one is the, kind of the least obvious, but it's the undercurrent to all these other ideas, is that we loved the game more and wanted to immerse ourselves in spoken word more deeply than the other people. And so here's the real problem for some people. You get all that coaching, you create your practice routines, you set your goals, you put in the huge reps, but if you don't inherently love the game of poker and want to learn how to grow and develop as a poker player, you're probably not gonna grow that much. It's like saying that you want to get really fit, but are you actually going to show up at the gym every morning? Are you going to do the lifts? Are you going to do the cardio? Are you going to go home and eat unsalted chicken for the rest of your life? Probably not. Some people really thrive on that challenge, or they're going to really kind of grow in that environment, and some other people are going to be eating donuts by day 3. And I am honestly a day 2 donut kind of guy. So, first things first, you want to be a good poker player, you have to commit to being a well-rounded, thoughtful poker player. You have to love the game, you want to absorb the knowledge like a sponge, and you have to constantly seek out that knowledge. And this is not the same as becoming a winning player. I've had students tell me that they didn't want to continue coaching because they didn't play enough 3-bet pots or 4-bet pots in their live game, and so they didn't actually want to deep dive into that theory because they didn't think it was going to help their hourly that much. And this is a complete misunderstanding about what coaching is about. You don't get coached to improve your immediate hourly, though often coaching will actually improve your hourly. You get coaching because you want to future-proof your game so you know how to handle the infinite novel situations that you're bound to face, that you've never studied, that you've never even considered in a solver. Especially when you play live poker, you're gonna see that all the time. So I've coached hundreds of students, many of them to the high stakes, and many to complete failure. I've had students tell me that they completely hate the game after they worked with me. But after 1 or 2 sessions, I can generally tell who's going to make it all the way and who's not. Right? Sometimes you can tell within a couple minutes. And here are the kind of the things that I look for in guys who are going to become crushers. First off, if you have success in another competitive field, you're probably going to make it in poker. So if you've studied another discipline and you've learned what it takes to be truly great at something, you're going to be great at poker. You're going to have the natural competitiveness, the desire to improve. You're going to be willing to make the sacrifices it takes to get to the top. It's all already baked into you. And it's no surprise that the players that I've coached to the top, they're already like pro gamers, pro athletes, pro hockey players, pro Magic the Gathering players. One guy was a world champion Rubik's Cube solver who already used a lot of algorithms in his day-to-day. And so these guys were all probably going to make it regardless of who coached them, as long as they got put in front of good material. The second thing I look for in a student are people who ask why a lot, right? So when I look at the break-even students, they don't ask why. They don't ask follow-up questions to confirm their understanding. They don't ask if a concept at hand applies to other scenarios. They don't try to get to the root of an idea beyond the surface. So one of my students that I know, or one of my students knows that after you 3-bet in a small blind against the button, on Jack 7-2, you can bet half pot or 2/3 pot with most of your range. But he doesn't know why this is the preferred size, right? If you ask him, oh, why are you betting, king queen here for the size? He can't actually tell you why. He just knows it's good in this spot. And so when you look at his hands, this becomes a theme over and over. You ask, why are you doing this? And his only answer is, oh, I saw it and I know it's good. But he can't actually tell you the reasoning or the mechanics behind the play. And so when that same player gets into new situations, because he doesn't understand underlying mechanics, he's going to get into a lot of trouble because he's not able to critically think and freestyle for himself. He'll just be parroting a lot of the techniques that he's seen professionals do before and hope that they are applicable to the exact scenario that he's in. And the third thing that I noticed all the time is that players have to actually be humble enough to take instruction. So I've had break-even students tell me that my advice is bad and that their reads on their game is way better and their population understanding is way better, and they don't actually have to listen to me. At the same time, a lot of these guys are break-even players, and so at some point they have to recognize that if they had godlike reads and they could make all these great hero folds and hero calls with a lot of consistency and they were correct, then they would be absolutely crushing their game. And so there's this weird paradox that low stakes players have where they think that on one hand they understand the population better, on the other hand they're not crushing it, right? And I found that when you teach these guys really good mechanics, even if the population read is a little bit murky, they're going to become crushers anyway. So what does that say? Maybe just playing, more efficient sizings and better technique is more important than having these really, really deep metagame reads. 2 years ago, I took on Wolfgang Poker as a student. And Wolfgang was really interesting because he didn't really come from an online background. He mostly played 1-2 live, which is like one of the absolute softest fields in poker. And so when he came to me, he had no preconceptions of what is really advanced theory, what is good or bad from a GTO standpoint. He just was a really blank slate, and he wanted to learn what were the techniques that were in practice really good, really efficient. And he really wants to learn on how to be, a much better all-around player. And guess what, right? Wolfgang is really humble. He asks why all the time. 2 years ago, he was playing 1-2, and the biggest pot that he ever won in his life was $3,000. And now Wolfgang often plays $10,000 or $20,000 buy-in games. So that says a lot about being willing to say you're not very good at poker and you are very open to getting better all the time. He still has that belief in him, which is why I think he's going to be a real crusher one day. So to be a great student, you have to first deeply love the game and want to improve, not just make more money in the short term. 2, you have to identify best practices through solvers, through coaching, through database analysis, through courses from one of the many different schools and producers. You have to relentlessly question best practices and why they are the best. This is something that I've definitely done over the years. My own course, Overnight Monster, has actually had 4 different updates, mostly to reflect updates in my solver knowledge, as I apply different bet sizes, as I learn from other coaches and from my own studies and training, I adapt my own materials to reflect that. And so you should be looking at material and seeing, is this the most cutting edge? Does this material recommend in some spots that I use 10% bet sizings? Right? There's a lot of questioning and advancement that you can keep pushing even from the experts. Or you need to create a dedicated practice loop with quantifiable benchmarks. You have to be humble enough to take this expert criticism and absorb it. And then 6, you have to have the ability to rep out and actually put all of these moves into practice, because, poker played completely in theory land is not actually profitable poker. If you're watching this video, you probably love poker. You've probably identified some best practices, or you're looking for best practices because you're on a channel called Alvin Teaches Poker, and you're probably humble enough to say that you're in a spot where you need to improve and that you're willing to accept criticism. So what you really need to do is constantly ask why you are doing X or Y technique rather than just parroting a technique that you've seen from a YouTuber. And then you also need to create a dedicated practice loop. Okay? So what does a dedicated practice loop look like in poker? Dedicated practice has to be measurable. It has to have quantifiable goals. And you have to have a clear process for improvement. With all these 3 steps, it's not dedicated practice. It's just going through the motions without a clear goal. So let's say you have a low turn C bet frequency, something like 25 to 30%. This is a problem that my students perennially come to me with. And so if you're struggling to find enough turn barrels, what do? You go into your solver, your course, or your playbook, or your coach, and you see what hand classes they recommend that you barrel on the turn, both for value and as bluff. And as you're listening to these different hand classes, take the ones that you recognize that you're not using, write them down, and then make sure that you are using them. So you're going to find 3 to 5 textures that you often give up on the turn, and write down examples of hands you should be firing more, right? A common example is, we should be betting ace-7 suited or ace-6 suited on, a dry king-8 2 board. So a hand class that I would often call a suited overcard and undercard to the board. And then once you've locked down these improvements for 3 to 5 textures, you pick another 3 to 5 textures, go back to the course, the playbook, the coach, and say, okay, cool, what are the other hands that I need to be barreling here? After you've gained all of that knowledge, go ahead and play 20 hands. Have your notes on your screen so okay, I should be barreling pocket 2s more as a bluff. I should be barreling these suited overcards more as a bluff. And then after 20 hands, you go back to your database and see, have your turn barrels meaningfully increased? And if they have not, then you go back to step 1. Go back to the expert, you see what the best practices are, you compare them to your own best practices, and you keep creating this loop until you get better. And once you've finished this process, that leak is going to be gone. You're going to become measurably stronger So now you can go identify another leak in your game, apply the same process, and after you clear 5 to 10 leaks, chances are not only is your game going to be unrecognizably stronger, but you're probably going to have already moved up 1 or 2 stages. Last thing I want to talk about is mental health. I've begun talking about this publicly on YouTube, but I personally suffer from PTSD, major anxiety, major depression through the majority of my adult life. It really sucks. It makes high stakes poker like really mentally taxing for me. I'm actually backed to play as large games as I want. Right? This is a very lucky kind of scenario for me. And so if I want to go play 10K, 20K games, off of, not on my own money, I have that option. But even with that option, there's some times where I just show up and I'm like, I'm just going to play 2-5, mostly because I don't even want to have the stress of losing $40,000 of someone else's money, because that is just so going to be emotionally taxing for me, even when I know this is 100% profitable and it doesn't actually risk my own personal bankroll. And that's difficult, right? You get a lot of imposter syndrome. You put a lot of self-worth in your results. You have to be really kind to yourself. So for me, I have a lot of personal safeguards in place in terms of my mental health to make sure that I am also playing my best. I don't play when I feel emotionally unstable. So I really, really focus hard on playing my A+ game. And so this is definitely one of the secrets that I have in terms of having a good win rate, is that I very rarely autopilot, and I play really, really conscious A+ poker. This is one of the I guess downsides of being an instructor sometimes, is that I don't get to really play my B game, right? And so because I'm always very consciously playing my A game, my win rate does get a little bit inflated because I don't have that much kind of like B+ junk time. Even if I'm winning and I feel tilted at a table, I immediately leave. There's been some times where I've been crushing in a session, just get hit whatever bad beat, or someone says something just like racist or shitty to me at a poker table, and it just irks me and I just don't want to be there, and I just allow myself the kindness to step away. And obviously from a dollar standpoint, sometimes this is detrimental, but in the long run, preserving my mental health is going to be much more dollar EV and also much more life EV. Okay? I also take antidepressants. I go for walks multiple times a day, regularly exercise. I have a dedicated practice of self-care that I am admittedly hit or miss with, but always try to do that physical activity, make sure I'm getting enough sleep, have professional guidance in place.